Now, we have a set of questions from Aldo concerning Champions Now. And he and I actually have talked about this. He actually sent them to me just after the deadline. And so I figured rather than make him suffer, I would, chat with him about them. So I'm presenting, I think, sort of a distilled version of my responses. There are a couple of very there are a couple of really, I think, interesting points here. One is just about my process of working on the game. Aldo references a point in my text where I said I thought I'd hit a stopping point. So these are my words. I thought I'd hit a stopping point beyond which I couldn't or wouldn't go, and wind up with not much more than a nostalgic best practices guide for this historical phase of the game. To my surprise, there came a traumatic moment of breaking a concept barrier, after which I could actually design my own champions after all. And at the time, I tried to verbally reconstruct that for Aldo, but in the intervening weeks, I actually, in going through the post, said, there it is. You can see me say pretty much exactly that in one of the posts at Out of Play. It's during the game that we called the Defiance, with Rod and Ross and Santiago. And then when I moved into the game that we called Legacy, with Alan Barkley and Vince. No, damn it, that was his character's name. I always do that. Well, anyway, when we played that one, I was in that mode of saying, I can actually design now. Several things shifted hard at that point. One, I started reducing the speed chart. First from 12 to 9 and then from 9 to 6. I was able to sort of break open things that I said, this doesn't really need to be there. I can throw out that. At that point and moving into the other game, let's see, that included Jason Walters and was set in LA. That's when I came up with the hazards rules, and that's when I came up with the some very fundamental notions about damage. Those are the times when I really shifted into game design. But it was right at that point during that Defiance game that I found myself changing a thing and saying, hey, this should change. And then I was like, whoa, that's not something they would have thought of. That's you can really see, the Ron jumping off right there. So that's when it was. Now, what specific types of situations did you have in mind? Now, again, Aldo quotes me, pro-villain tip, it's fun to pull a reversal with yet other powers or qualities which unleash who knows what awfulness, only without the focus or other limitation, especially if the villain hates and fears the awfulness. Anyways, you can see from my quick reading there, this is a bunch of stuff packed in. I mean, I packed in so much. I was thinking I was making an aside, and then the aside turned out to contain this, and then I add a qualifying phrase or an and what about phrase to it, and it's just, I should have wrote a paragraph. So what this means, we were talking here about significant limitations built into a given power. And the idea, and the classic example, especially for a villain, which is what I'm talking about here, is a focus, a device. So the thing is horrifically powerful, but it is a device. And if it has the focus limitation, that presents certain rules features, which basically means it's easy to take away. So what I'm suggesting here is that in terms of character build, this particular villain has exactly what I just described, but they also have a version of the same power, or perhaps some other one, but let's, for simplicity, a version of the same power, which is horrifically powerful, much more powerful even than the one on the focus. But it can only work if the focus is ruined or taken away or otherwise made unavailable to the villain. And perhaps has other limitations on it. Involuntary is an excellent example. And then the villain, hates and fears this. Basically, it's the power unleashed. He or she was actually using the focus not as the source of the power. I have the freeze gun. No. It's a channeler, or actually a restrictor of that same power. And so you take it away and the villain's like, no! Right? And then the true power is unleashed. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about there. Definitely see his issue. The phrasing of it is like clippity clop and runs off, with what I'm thinking. It doesn't really say what I'm thinking in digestible chunks. So here it says, just before Power Stars Now, I wrote the following material, blah, blah, blah. It's basically a presentation of the now. And it was supposed to be set off into italics and distinctive text, and possibly even onto its own full pages, the now, as I was using it at a particular point. And it's just kind of folded into the text with no change in format. So it's kind of difficult to tell what's up. So I'm not entirely certain that can be recovered by talking about that specific text. I do think that his real question, which is what's bolded, what's italicized, also, let's dial it all the way back to what I really do with the now. In my files, which are typed on the screen, I have red text versus default black text. I also have bolded versus unbolded. Italicizing was supposed to be standing in for the red because the interior was black and white. So let's just set that aside. We're talking now about what I do. What I do is I have the now, and if it is bolded, it means hot, coming in hot. This is, I'm playing that. Next session, that gets played. This character, walks on. If nobody goes up to that character, this character walks on. They have things to do with the circumstances of play, or some event which has been impending, or whatever. It happens. It's or is about to happen very explicitly. I mean, this is on. So that's what bolding is. And then what's red is anything that I don't think I know well enough. And it can indicate either that I need to do a little bit of, work on this. I'll have like a villain name and it's in red and there's nothing else there. It means to reminding me, excuse me, you haven't actually made that character yet. Maybe you should, beef this up a little bit. We need content here. Another reason is because it's something I need to ask a player. So it might, under the now, underneath that particular character, it might say something like, family's home is where, and a question mark, and I'll put that in red. It just means either before play or during play. It doesn't really matter. Or it might be one or the other is better. I need to ask. So that's what the red means, is that uncertainty, information needed. Either I need to get to work on it or someone else needs to give me information about it. And then the bold is, do this. And of course, sometimes, a given piece of text could be both, which means I need to, if that's red and I need to play it right away, I need to get pretty on the job here. So with any luck, that clarifies, without setting aside the nature of that particular book text, that clarifies what I'm really talking about. Let's see here. In the section Strong Stuff, you mentioned force field that only works against knockback and it's ass. Knockback defense works against knockback. Force field doesn't work against knockback at all. So if you want to have a force field that keeps you from being knocked around, you need to actually combine that power with the components force field and knockback defense, period. So I don't know what I was thinking. I was probably writing away before the structure was in place, and then that ends up being an artifact. But it's ass. Sharpie, right? but the other thing I talk about, special defense ego as options to model strong characters from the comics. That's valid. And think of any number of other defenses. One might even think of forms of force wall and force field in their proper, rules construction, as aspects of this as well. In fact, I even think I give a pretty good example of force wall. The idea here to model strong characters from the comics. I'm curious, says Aldo, about what you had in mind for the special defense ego. Are you thinking of those moments in comics when hulking and sometimes enraged behemoths seem to muscle through attempts at mind control aimed almost as if they were pushing their way through a physical obstacle? And the answer is yes. That's exactly what I'm thinking about. In the force wall example that's in the text, which I'm quite fond of, there's an example of a reactive force wall with no range, so you can't place it far away from yourself. And the idea is that you are this strong character, and it also has the constraint, that it goes away, right? That it can't be maintained. So that would be the constrained limitation to structure it properly. And basically, it's one of those things where the dude says, "Get behind me," and throws out an arm. And all the incoming attack just, bounces off him, and one bounces off the arm, right, to show you that it was a good idea for them to have done so, and nobody else gets hurt. In game terms, that's force wall. Now, in the fiction, of course, there is no wall created. It's just the dude interposing their body in a proper fashion. And it's one of the ways you can have reactivity. Look at that reactive advantage. It's a big deal. It's a primary way that you use the speed chart without being pumped into, a metronome. So, that's for that. What's next? Because Aldo was prolific. And this is related. He's talking about adaptive effects. Now, there's two levels of adaptive effects. One is the one where you can do a thing by itself. I mean, you can actually just go ahead and use whatever power this is, and that it often or it can take on the properties of some aspect of the environment or whatever is incoming or something that it's interacting with. Then the more intense form of it is when you can't use the power except when some of the appropriate materials or conditions are there. So basically, it's adaptive special effects in the sense that it only operates when you touch iron or when you touch cloth. You have to touch a thing, or you have to be involved with that thing in some way for your power to work at all. So those are the two levels. And what kind of confused Aldo, because it took a little while to work out this in dialogue, so I'll give you the outcome. What had confused Aldo was that technically any one of the advantages and limitations could be played not as a formal advantage or limitation, just as a special effect. So if you wanted your character to have a wind blast, you can just get a blast and say it's a wind blast. And that means that all kinds of aspects of being a wind blast come into play, but they come in ad lib and they are not expected to be consistent, even if they sometimes have mechanics like an extra die of damage or something because of what's going on, and it's wind after all. Even when they're mechanics, they are not reliable in terms of gameplay. You can't say, well, last time I got an extra die. No, it's just whenever and however it occurs to you, the player, to mention, it's since it's a wind blast, this is awesome, right? And everybody's like, oh, it is awesome. So, there you go. You get your +1. Or whatever, secondary effects occur because it's a wind blast. But again, those are ad-libbed. It's you or it's a game master or someone else. And when it happens and whether it applies this time, it has no logic at all. It's because we thought of it, or because that would be fun, because that's what we see. And that's it. So that's special effects. Now, the nature of taking limitations and advantages is to lock in components of your special effects into a consistent form so that that particular power is used in that fashion all the time. Those particular numbers will apply. Those particular qualities with numbers and ranges and stuff like that, they will apply. So think of it as a codified special effect. Now, some of the advantages are so nuanced that it is theoretically possible, but actually would be annoying in comparison to use them just as special effects and not codify them as advantages or limitations. An example of something that's not like that is having an object. It's perfectly okay to have an object and not define it as a focus. And the rules about how easy to take away a focus don't apply. Doesn't mean it can't be taken away. It is an object, but the rules for taking away a focus do not apply. So that's an example of where it's not annoying to either have it be a focus or not a focus. And no matter what, it is still an object that can be taken away. Either one. It's just the focus kind of lets you know it will be taken away. So in the case of separation or separate and adaptive special effects, I think are the two most obvious examples. They're a little different. Yes, you could play a character whose special effects are adaptive in that sense and not have that advantage. But it so happens that it's more fun to use it with the advantage. That's something that it's more fun to lock it in than it is to let it kind of bounce around as to circumstances of non-fictional circumstances as well as fictional ones as to whether it applies or not. This is something you do want, consistent. And so separate and adaptive special effects and a couple of others, again, I'm not going to stop you from just treating them as special effects and not take that advantage. I'm not going to say, oh, you have to have separate to make that work. That's not the logic at all. But I think it's more fun to use it. I think the advantages are well built. And you look at it and you go, I really want to do it that way. So that's my thinking on that. And that's kind of where Aldo was, trying to wrap his head around the logic of the rules. Now, regarding hazards, the one you can fight. Yes, breakable hazards, defense and body as the materials warrant. And what's important about that is in terms of fighting hazards and the bugaboo of all hero system veterans, the squad of trained agents, which is just like insanely important to these people. And Aldo I'm leaving out of that actually because I think he's long ago, kind of managed to separate himself from the vagaries of that particular community. The idea here is, okay, you're fighting a hazard, which is defined by a number of hexes. As defined as a squad of trained agents, they can separate, they can move around, right? These different hexes. It's a 10 hex hazard, and they can, the hexes, run around and can be the source of, the hazard, each one of them. So you're fighting one of them and you hit one of them. Now remember the rules for hazards. If you hit one of them, you take away a hex. That hex is gone as a hazard because you hit it. We're done as far as that issue is concerned. The next question is, how broken is it? And taking it as a given that it has been taken out, we don't have to worry about knockout or anything. We don't have those numbers for these characters. They're taken out as a hazard. We're done. If you did enough damage to a human body, because these characters have no defense, as it turns out, remember, they just have body. If we're looking at them as materials, they would have 10 body. It's up to you, if you do over 10 body, whether they're killed or not. Because when you do that to a person in this game, whoever delivered it gets to say whether it's lethal at that time. So, I mean, at the point of, death, you get to say so. So taking out the hazard is, and you did, 2 body to it, fantastic. You hit it. That's knocked out of the hazard section. The next question is whether you vaporized it or not. Well, did you do enough damage to vaporize 10 body? If you did vaporize, have enough juice to vaporize 10 body, it is your option still to say whether you did, or whether you kind of get to draw, sort of vaporized dude who's then just lying there smoking on the ground, but not vaporized. So that is up to you to say. Hopefully this makes some sense and we can carry on with the fact that, remember, if you're dealing with that, quote, trained squad or whatever, that's vulnerable to ordinary attacks of this kind, whereas your non-fightable hazard is not. You can't just, shoot your basic hazard. By the way, that reminds me, there is something that we clarified before we started this part of the conversation that I should clarify now. Don't forget that whenever we talk about hazards, always, we have to give them their 3 criteria. Their criteria are what effects do they deliver in terms of being a power, what effect that you may have, that means the effect doesn't work on you. Sometimes it's a roll that you might make. Sometimes it's, just having a certain power. If you have D-solid, this doesn't work on you. That's another category. The third is, what do you do that turns off the hazard? And that's the whole hazard. Okay? All of it. I've found that in talking about hazards, that people, when they start talking quickly and just saying a hazard, you have to say back up, make the hazard first. Now we can talk about it. And they quickly realize that if they want the trained squad to be, vulnerable about this, or if they want this particular trained squad, their weapons don't work on that, that clarifies at least 90% of the anxiety that they had felt based on, but my character's up against 10 people shooting at him. Oh no, right? So don't forget too that you don't have 10 hexes each delivering the hazard separately. In the fiction you do, but the hazard only has those dice. And removing hexes doesn't reduce the dice. So it's a good thing. I mean, you can eventually get rid of the hazard by removing the hexes, but the dice will stay the dice. The last dude is as effective as the squad was. So if you understand all of that about hazards, and they're properly constructed, fully, constructed by the rules, then you ask the question that you were worried about, and you suddenly realize that it was hardly a question at all. It's no big deal. So let's see, in the 5th paragraph on page 195, yes, you can heave an object that's 2 levels below your strength on the strength chart, a number of hexes equal to the strength dice you're using. So Aldo says, the way I read that, a character with strength 8d6 could lift a motorcycle, which requires 46 to lift. So that's, more than 2 levels down. And wing it 8 hexes because you have 8d6 strength. It says, is that correct? Or do you subtract the 4 from the 8 and then that's how many? No. You got strength 8d6. Throw that thing 8 hexes. As long as it's 2 levels or more down from you, that's how far you can throw it. Not particularly graded, in terms of nuance, but it works really well. Okay, so that's how that works. And oh yes, the mind bar maneuver. So the mental maneuvers, yeah, there's some pretty nice stuff in there. Um, with any luck, you have played the combat and understand the reactivity and understand the sequence, and particularly losing an action and stuff like that. So here's how it works. He writes, if someone attacks my character with a mental power, I can opt for a mind bar as a free action. So it's like the mental version of a martial block. This is true. This gives me a +1 to my ego-based combat value. Also true. If the attacker misses, the power is trapped and can't be used further, which remains the case as long as I dedicate a half-phase action to barring the attack. All correct. The attacker can spend a half-phase action to disengage from the bar with no roll required, at which point they can try again. Also correct. So the part that's not clear is the part about missing the target, and that's actually something that he interposed in there in reading. You mind bar it coming in whether it hits you or not. So you mind bar it and it may do damage to you, but you've got that mind bar on it. So, and then the attacker has to either say, okay, well, that power is mind barred, I can't use it against this guy, and go on and do everything else they want to do, or they can take a half-phase action and, drop that attack, basically extricating it from your mind bar. So, that is how it works. There you go. That's our questions. Not that many. Well, Otto had a lot, but pretty deep questions, all of them. I think it's a nice range from the full medium of play, all the way down to the nuances of a particular combat maneuver, showing the scale of operations, the thing we do.